Chapter 17. Tuesday morning. When Doreen woke the next morning, she felt like her body was weighted down with troubles. She slowly got up, sat on the edge of her bed, and rotated her shoulders to try to loosen the tension. She remembered her middle-of-the-night trip to her backyard, got up, and walked over to the window. It was hard to imagine what was down there, but the rocks were still there in the garden, exactly where she'd placed them. She dressed quickly, headed downstairs, put on her morning pot of coffee, and walked out to the garden while her coffee dripped. She knew her place would be chaos again once the movers arrived, and wanted a few moments to herself. She stood at the bottom of the garden path and studied the smudge in the dirt, outlined by her special rock formation. She took several more photos of it. Whoever it was had stepped in the corner of the turned-over garden and had slipped downward, leaving a mark, but nothing helpful or distinguishable, except to prove that she'd had a visitor. She stood for a long moment, her mind trying to formulate ideas, but nothing came to explain this. Because if her intruder had come across the grass, which he had, she had witnessed it from her bedroom window, surely there'd be visible tracks of his footprints in the dirt as well. But she found none, only here at the corner of the garden, as if he'd walked the edge of her path on the rocks, deliberately avoiding leaving any tracks. Frowning, she turned and walked back to the house, the animals shuffling along at her side. Muggs perked his ears up and he raced to the back door. She called out to him, "Hey Muggs. What's the matter, buddy?" But he barked and jumped up on the kitchen door. She opened the door, although she'd had it propped open, but her chair had slipped off to the side. Or it had had some help. Hating the suspicion that was ever present now, she pushed open the door, and Muggs raced across the hallway to the front door. She propped the back door open again with a kitchen chair, and headed to the front door. Instead of something or someone suspicious, she found Scott and the moving truck here already. She opened the screen door in surprise. "I wasn't expecting you quite this early," she admitted. "It's after 8, he said gently. "Did you get any sleep? You look like you had a bad night." "I had a bad night," she said wearily. "But that seems to be the way of it these days." "I'm sure protecting these antiques has been difficult," he said sympathetically. "You have no idea," she said. "I've had so many break-ins and intruders. Even last night, I had somebody in the backyard with a flashlight." He stared at her in horror. "Seriously?" "Yes," she said, "seriously. And how wrong is that?" "Oh dear," he said. "Well, let's get everything out of here if we can today. Agatha is bringing a different vehicle with proper crating for the pictures." "Good," she said. "What about John?" Scott nodded. "John is coming with Agatha." "Perfect," she said. "Please take it all. I'd love for the thieves to come in and find the place empty." And at that, they propped open the front door, and the chaos began. She stayed out of the way as much as she could, even wondering if she should run down to the bank, but hated to leave the animals alone with the doors wide open. She could take them in the car, but not into the bank itself. Even as she was deciding, Agatha drove up and an older stooped man with more of a dusting of fuzz than actual hair on his head, got out and walked toward Doreen. She met him on the front lawn out of the way of the rest of the chaos. She shook John's hand. "Hi," she said. "Nice to meet you, and hopefully the trip here will be worth it." He just smiled and said, "I've made a lot of trips that weren't worth it. It's nice to meet you in person." He looked at Agatha. "Besides, Agatha said she'd found several wonderful finds, and I know Scott already has. So I'm hoping you could pull another rabbit out of the hat and find some treasure for me too." She smiled and said, "Well, I'm more than willing for you to see what there is, but I honestly can't tell you if they are originals or fakes. I don't know the difference." He nodded and said, "That's the best attitude to have. Let's go take a look, shall we?" She led the way back in, pausing to give Muggs a chance to sniff around the newcomers and bark at them again. "I'm sorry." The animals are a little on edge, she said by way of explanation when Muggs still barked at them. Just so many people are here now. Agatha waved her hand. The animals calmed down yesterday just fine. I'm sure it'll be okay. I have 2 specialists with me as well. That was the first time Doreen noticed the 2 men behind her. They'll help pack up the paintings. So I'll leave you and John for a moment while I direct them to the work we need to do. Agatha led her team into the living room and then through the dining room, and as Doreen watched, Agatha pointed out which paintings she was taking. John looked at her quizzically. I guess this is quite chaotic for you, isn't it? Doreen chuckled. Chaotic, wonderful, scary, all of the above, she admitted. You don't realize how valuable something is until somebody tells you, and then you look at it with completely different eyes, and you're worried you did something earlier to damage it. He nodded. Maybe you could show me the books, and I could be the first one to be done. She gave him a wide smile. Come on, she said. We're in the quiet corner of the house. She led the way through to the kitchen and then to the alcove where she kept the printer, next to the pantry. So this is the area of junk, she said with a half a grin. And I hadn't realized the books stored here in the pantry were worth anything. I had my Nan over, who is responsible for all the purchases in this house, and she pulled out the ones she thought were the most valuable and stacked them here. She turned and pointed to a few books on the chair at the edge of the table. So maybe start with those. Good, he said. It sounds like she has already done half the work for me. Doreen pulled out a second chair before motioning to an empty one and said, If you would like to sit, enjoy. He sat down, looked at the cup of coffee in her hand and asked, Is that coffee? She chuckled. I usually put a pot on when I know Scott's coming, she said. Would you like a cup? I would love a cup, he said warmly, and thank you very much for being such a lovely hostess. Then he picked up the first book and he was lost. She stood for a moment as she watched his rapt face while turning the pages, gently looking at copyrights, condition, bindings. More unnerved than she expected to be, she poured the last of the old coffee into a cup and made a fresh pot. She knew Scott would drink at least one of the cups, and she suspected this pot would be gone quickly too. When she had it dripping, she sat down beside John and waited for him to speak. He'd set 2 books on the table side by side. She didn't know if that was the start of his piles, or if that was just because he wanted to keep the books separated. She didn't ask any questions, just waited quietly. Then she remembered the music. She went to the corner of the pantry, jam-packed full of paperwork, so much so that she hadn't had a chance to go through it all. Maybe while John was looking at the books was a good time. She grabbed a couple stacks, making one huge stack, which completely emptied that shelf. Doreen brought everything to the kitchen table, sat down at one end and sorted, making piles on the floor and piles on the remaining chairs. She had a recipe stack. She had notes from Nan about various things that Doreen would have to ask her about, like these information articles. Apparently Nan was curious about everything. Doreen sorted through piece after piece until she had a big stack that made no sense to her, so she would be forced to ask Nan about all this. She further sorted this big stack into informational pieces Nan had printed off, articles she'd torn out of magazines and newspapers, pamphlets she'd been given, even take-out menus. Once done, Doreen was up and gathering another stack. She was on the 4th pantry shelf, holding just assorted pages of paper, and feeling damn good about what was happening, when John made an odd sound. She looked at him and asked in a quiet voice, Are you okay? He held up the Ulysses book. This is a first printing, he said. First edition, first printing. He turned to look at her, his gaze wide. Do you have any idea what it's worth? She shook her head. I have no clue. I'm so far out of the realm of what any of this is worth that every price is shocking me. He said He was at a loss for words. Priceless? At that, he gave a soft chuckle, breaking his reverie. Well, there will be collectors who want to pay a price for it. And I hesitate to even suggest what it could be worth. It will be in a prime spot in the Christie's catalog though. If it even makes it that far. I do have a number of private collectors. I'll have to see what kind of price they're willing to pay. Is that fair? She asked curiously. At least in the catalog, everybody gets a chance to bid. Spoken like a true entrepreneur, he said. Because in the catalog, of course, the bidding could go much higher than any estimate. Well, I have no clue, she said. So you are the professional, and you need to tell me the best way forward. He still held Ulysses in his hand with such a reverence that she realized just how wrong it was for her to own these pieces. You're just reinforcing that I need to sell these books, she said quietly. You have such a reverence for them, such a respect, and for me, they're just dusty old tomes. At that, he looked shocked, and then he spluttered with laughter. At least you're honest, my dear. I am at that, she said, and I'm still stuck at the stage where money is food and I'm in survival mode, she admitted. But even if I had lots of money, this wouldn't be my choice of what to spend it on. They just don't appeal to me. Part of me feels bad because these are very special items, but I'm just not the rightful owner. There are people who would be very glad to hear that, he said, because they do want to be the rightful owners. She motioned at the books in front of him. You have 4 there. Are any of them decent or just the one in your hand? All of them are valuable, he admitted, his fingers gently stroking the leather bindings on the surface of each of the 4. Very different categories, different prices, but if you agree, I'll take all 4. She nodded and smiled. And that stack? He smiled gently. Don't rush me, he said. When it's a thing of beauty, you want to take the right time to honor it. And he returned to the Ulysses book in his hand, his fingers almost trembling. She sighed happily. Nan will be delighted to know she made such good investments. He smiled at her and said, Your Nan is a genius. In many, many ways, Doreen said. She had a lot of fun doing this. Then she's lucky too, John said. Because too often, collectors become obsessive over their finds, where she appears to have not even taken care of them properly. Doreen felt horrified at that comment. But then as she looked at the stack of books and the shelves they were on, she had to admit he had a point. For her, I think it was the joy of the find, the hunt, the negotiating. It wasn't about acquiring. It wasn't about ownership. It was about the joy of the process. Some people are like that, he said. You're very blessed. He reached for the next book. She watched him for a moment and then gave herself a shake. The moving men were here. She needed to find as much as she could while they were still going through this stuff. She got up and removed everything from the next 2 shelves in the pantry, so she had a big stack in front of her on the kitchen table. She still had a couple shorter shelves on one side and more across from that, all filled with paper. She needed to speed this up if she had any hope of getting through this before the experts left. Focused, she quickly sorted and tossed them into her trash pile, making sure not one of those pieces of paper was of any value or at least any value at first glance. She'd have to go through it one more time later before actually tossing this pile. The pile of unknowns was a bit of a curiosity too, but it was the smallest of the piles. An hour later, she sat back. She refilled everyone's coffee and returned to the 2 short shelves in the pantry. She removed everything from those 2 shelves, stacking it up on the kitchen table, and went through it all. When she turned around next, Scott smiled at her stacks of paperwork and said, At least you're getting through some of this now. She nodded. Those 2 shelving units in the pantry there, the standalone cherry ones, let me know if they're of any interest to you or whether I can fully reload them again, she said with a laugh. He examined them both and said, Just go ahead and refill them, but maybe with a little bit more care. She nodded. I will do that. She had stacks everywhere, but one of the biggest piles was designated as garbage trash. She grabbed a large brown paper grocery bag, found she needed 2 of them, and filled them both full of stuff she wasn't keeping. With some of that cleaned up and 3 good stacks on the table now, she went back to another bookshelf in the pantry. She started with the little one this time, where she had moved recipe books to the far side, and then realized the front closet had more recipe books too. She removed the items as fast as she could, until the small shelving unit was empty. Then she began in on the bigger shelving unit again. By the time she'd emptied the top 2 shelves, the table was stacked full of stuff again. She groaned. Working as fast as she could, she sorted piece of paper after piece of paper. If she couldn't tell what it was, she stuck it in the Ask Nan pile. It took an hour before she could finally lift her head, and John stared at her in amazement. She glanced at him and smiled. "Lots of this stuff is just junk," she said, motioning to the pile on the floor. "Some of it, as you can see, is a collection of takeout menus which, by now, are so old and outdated they might as well go in the garbage too. That's the Ask Nan pile. Here are all the recipes Nan has printed off, and this is paperwork of some kind I still have to sort through." He nodded and said, "It's a really good thing you're doing this then." She smiled. "Indeed it is." She glanced at his stack. She'd kept her eye on it the whole time she'd worked, and he still had 3 books to go. Instead of stacked up, the books were now stretched out across his end of the kitchen table beside each other. "Any luck?" "Phenomenal luck," he said. "So far I'll take every one off your hands." She beamed. "This sounds like a very lucky day for me. I know more things of value could be in here, and I just want to make sure I have a chance to search through everything while you guys are here." She took the stuff off of the 3rd and 4th shelves, stacked it up, and then dropped to her knees and pulled out the cookbooks and other books on the bottom shelf. "You let me know if anything here has any value," she said, as she laid them out one at a time atop her end of the kitchen table. He looked at them and said, "Cookbooks? I highly doubt it." She said, "This one's turn of the century I think, but I don't know which century." He held out a hand, and she handed it to him. The others were much more modern, so she moved them to the other pantry shelf. "Now look at that. I have 2 empty sets of shelving and a big mess in the kitchen," she said with a chuckle. "This cookbook is valuable," he said. "Certainly not on the same level as all these other books, but definitely a few $1,000s." She looked at it, smiled, and said, "Perfect. Then that one's for you too."